Chapter 41 of the Mayor of Casterbridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 41. Henchard went home. The morning having now fully broke, he lit his fire and sat abstractedly beside it. He had not sat there long when a gentle footstep approached the house and entered the passage, a finger tapping lightly at the door. Henchard's face brightened, for he knew the motions to be Elizabeth's. She came into his room looking wan and sad. "Have you heard?" she asked. "Mrs. Farfrae, she is dead. Yes, indeed, about an hour ago." "I know it," said Henchard. "I have but lately come in from there. It is so very good of 'ee, Elizabeth, to come and tell me. You must be so tired out, too, with sitting up. Now do you abide here with me this morning. You can go and rest in the other room, and I will call 'ee when breakfast is ready." To please him and herself, for his recent kindliness was winning a surprised gratitude from the lonely girl, she did as he bade her, and lay down on a sort of couch which Henchard had rigged up out of a settle in the adjoining room. She could hear him moving about in his preparations, but her mind ran most strongly on Lucetta, whose death in such fullness of life and amid such cheerful hopes of maternity was appallingly unexpected. Presently she fell asleep. Meanwhile her stepfather in the outer room had set the breakfast in readiness, but finding that she dozed he would not call her. He waited on, looking into the fire and keeping the kettle boiling with housewifely care, as if it were an honour to have her in his house. In truth, a great change had come over him with regard to her, and he was developing the dream of a future lit by her filial presence, as though that way alone could happiness lie. He was disturbed by another knock at the door, and rose to open it, rather deprecating a call from anybody just then. A stoutly built man stood on the doorstep, with an alien, unfamiliar air about his figure and bearing, an air which might have been called colonial by people of cosmopolitan experience. It was the man who had asked the way at Peter's Finger. Henchard nodded and looked inquiry. "Good morning, good morning," said the stranger with profuse heartiness. "Is it Mr. Henchard I am talking to?" "My name is Henchard." "Then I've caught 'ee at home. That's right. Morning's the time for business, says I. Can I have a few words with you?" "By all means," Henchard answered, showing the way in. "You may remember me," said his visitor, seating himself. Henchard observed him indifferently and shook his head. "Well, perhaps you may not. My name is Newson." Henchard's face and eyes seemed to die. The other did not notice it. "I know the name well," Henchard said at last, looking on the floor. "I make no doubt of that. Well, the fact is, I've been looking for 'ee this fortnight past. I landed at Havenpool, and went through Casterbridge on my way to Falmouth, and when I got there they told me you had some years before been living at Casterbridge. Back came I again, and by long and by late I got here by coach 10 minutes ago. He lives down by the mill, says they, so here I am. Now, that transaction between us some 20 years agone, 'tis that I've called about. 'Twas a curious business. I was younger then than I am now, and perhaps the less said about it in one sense the better." "Curious business! 'Twas worse than curious. I cannot even allow that I'm the man you met then. I was not in my senses, and a man's senses are himself." "We were young and thoughtless," said Newson. "However, I've come to mend matters rather than open arguments. Poor Susan, hers was a strange experience. She was a warm-hearted, homespun woman. She was not what they call shrewd or sharp at all. Better she had been. She was not. As you in all likelihood know, she was simple-minded enough to think that the sale was in a way binding. She was as guiltless of wrong-doing in that particular as a saint in the clouds." "I know it, I know it. I found it out directly," said Henchard, still with averted eyes. "There lay the sting o't to me. If she had seen it as what it was she would never have left me. Never. But how should she be expected to know? What advantages had she? None. She could write her own name, and no more." "Well, it was not in my heart to undeceive her when the deed was done," said the sailor of former days. "I thought, and there was not much vanity in thinking it, that she would be happier with me. She was fairly happy, and I never would have undeceived her till the day of her death. Your child died. She had another. and all went well. But a time came—mind me, a time always does come—a time came, it was some while after she and I and the child returned from America, when somebody she had confided her history to told her my claim to her was a mockery, and made a jest of her belief in my right. After that she was never happy with me. She pined and socked and sighed. She said she must leave me, and then came the question of our child. Then a man advised me how to act, and I did it, for I thought it was best. I left her at Falmouth and went off to sea. When I got to the other side of the Atlantic there was a storm, and it was supposed that a lot of us, including myself, had been washed overboard. I got ashore at Newfoundland, and then I asked myself what I should do. Since I'm here, here I'll bide, I thought to myself. 'Twill be most kindness to her, now she's taken against me, to let her believe me lost. For, I thought, while she supposes us both alive, she'll be miserable. But if she thinks me dead, she'll go back to him, and the child will have a home. I've never returned to this country till a month ago, and I found that, as I supposed, she went to you, and my daughter with her. They told me in Falmouth that Susan was dead. But my Elizabeth Jane, where is she?" "Dead likewise," said Henchard doggedly. "Surely you learnt that too?" The sailor started up, and took an enervated pace or two down the room. "Dead!" he said in a low voice. "Then what's the use of my money to me?" Henchard, without answering, shook his head, as if that were rather a question for Newson himself than for him. "Where is she buried?" the traveller inquired. "Beside her mother," said Henchard in the same stolid tones. "When did she die?" "A year ago and more," replied the other without hesitation. The sailor continued standing. Henchard never looked up from the floor. At last Newson said, "My journey hither has been for nothing. I may as well go as I came. It has served me right. I'll trouble you no longer." Henchard heard the retreating footsteps of Newson upon the sanded floor, the mechanical lifting of the latch, the slow opening and closing of the door that was natural to a balked or dejected man. But he did not turn his head. Newson's shadow passed the window. He was gone. Then Henchard, scarcely believing the evidence of his senses, rose from his seat amazed at what he had done. It had been the impulse of a moment. The regard he had lately acquired for Elizabeth, the new-sprung hope of his loneliness that she would be to him a daughter of whom he could feel as proud as of the actual daughter she still believed herself to be, had been stimulated by the unexpected coming of Newson to a greedy exclusiveness in relation to her, so that the sudden prospect of her loss had caused him to speak mad lies like a child, in pure mockery of consequences. He had expected questions to close in round him and unmask his fabrication in 5 minutes. Yet such questioning had not come. But surely they would come. Newson's departure could be but momentary. He would learn all by inquiries in the town, and return to curse him, and carry his last treasure away. He hastily put on his hat, and went out in the direction that Newson had taken. Newson's back was soon visible up the road, crossing Bull Stake. Henchard followed, and saw his visitor stop at the King's Arms, where the morning coach which had brought him waited half an hour for another coach which crossed there. The coach Newson had come by was now about to move again. Newson mounted, his luggage was put in, and in a few minutes the vehicle disappeared with him. He had not so much as turned his head. It was an act of simple faith in Henchard's words, faith so simple as to be almost sublime. The young sailor who had taken Susan Henchard on the spur of the moment, and on the faith of a glance at her face, more than 20 years before, was still living and acting under the form of the grizzled traveller who had taken Henchard's words on trust so absolute as to shame him as he stood. Was Elizabeth Jane to remain his by virtue of this hardy invention of a moment? "Perhaps not for long," said he. Newson might converse with his fellow travellers, some of whom might be Casterbridge people, and the trick would be discovered. This probability threw Henchard into a defensive attitude, and instead of considering how best to right the wrong and acquaint Elizabeth's father with the truth at once, he bethought himself of ways to keep the position he had accidentally won. Towards the young woman herself his affection grew more jealously strong with each new hazard to which his claim to her was exposed. He watched the distant highway, expecting to see Newson return on foot, enlightened and indignant, to claim his child. But no figure appeared. Possibly he had spoken to nobody on the coach, but buried his grief in his own heart. His grief! What was it, after all, to that which he, Henchard, would feel at the loss of her? Newson's affection cooled by years could not equal his who had been constantly in her presence, and thus his jealous soul speciously argued to excuse the separation of father and child. He returned to the house, half expecting that she would have vanished. No, there she was, just coming out from the inner room, the marks of sleep upon her eyelids, and exhibiting a generally refreshed air. "Oh, father," she said, smiling, "I had no sooner lain down than I napped, though I did not mean to. I wonder I did not dream about poor Mrs. Farfrae after thinking of her so, but I did not. How strange it is that we do not often dream of latest events, absorbing as they may be." "I am glad you have been able to sleep," he said, taking her hand with anxious proprietorship, an act which gave her a pleasant surprise. They sat down to breakfast, and Elizabeth Jane's thoughts reverted to Lucetta. Their sadness added charm to a countenance whose beauty had ever lain in its meditative soberness. "Father," she said, as soon as she recalled herself to the outspread meal, "it is so kind of you to get this nice breakfast with your own hands, and I idly asleep the while." "I do it every day," he replied. "You have left me, everybody has left me. How should I live but by my own hands?" "You are very lonely, are you not?" "Ay, child, to a degree that you know nothing of. It is my own fault. You are the only one who has been near me for weeks, and you will come no more." "Why do you say that? Indeed I will, if you would like to see me." Henchard signified dubiousness. Though he had so lately hoped that Elizabeth Jane might again live in his house as daughter, he would not ask her to do so now. Newson might return at any moment, and what Elizabeth would think of him for his deception it were best to bear apart from her. When they had breakfasted his stepdaughter still lingered, till the moment arrived at which Henchard was accustomed to go to his daily work. Then she arose, and with assurance of coming again soon went up the hill in the morning sunlight. "At this moment her heart is as warm towards me as mine is towards her. She would live with me here in this humble cottage for the asking. Yet before the evening probably he will have come, and then she will scorn me." This reflection, constantly repeated by Henchard to himself, accompanied him everywhere through the day. His mood was no longer that of the rebellious, ironical, reckless misadventurer, but the leaden gloom of one who has lost all that can make life interesting or even tolerable. There would remain nobody for him to be proud of, nobody to fortify him, for Elizabeth Jane would soon be but as a stranger, and worse. Susan, Farfrae, Lucetta, Elizabeth, all had gone from him, one after one, either by his fault or by his misfortune. In place of them he had no interest, hobby, or desire. If he could have summoned music to his aid his existence might even now have been borne, for with Henchard music was of regal power. The merest trumpet or organ tone was enough to move him, and high harmonies transubstantiated him. But hard fate had ordained that he should be unable to call up this divine spirit in his need. The whole land ahead of him was as darkness itself. There was nothing to come, nothing to wait for. Yet in the natural course of life he might possibly have to linger on earth another 30 or 40 years, scoffed at best pitied. The thought of it was unendurable. To the east of Casterbridge lay moors and meadows through which much water flowed. The wanderer in this direction, who should stand still for a few moments on a quiet night, might hear singular symphonies from these waters, as from a lampless orchestra, all playing in their sundry tones from near and far parts of the moor. At a hole in a rotten weir they executed a recitative. Where a tributary brook fell over a stone breastwork they trilled cheerily, under an arch they performed a metallic cymballing, and at Durnover Hole they hissed. The spot at which their instrumentation rose loudest was a place called 10 Hatches, whence during high springs there proceeded a very fugue of sounds. The river here was deep and strong at all times, and the hatches on this account were raised and lowered by cogs and a winch. A patch led from the second bridge over the highway, so often mentioned, to these hatches, crossing the stream at their head by a narrow plank bridge. But after nightfall human beings were seldom found going that way, the path leading only to a deep reach of the stream called Blackwater, and the passage being dangerous. Henchard, however, leaving the town by the east road, proceeded to the second, or stone bridge, and thence struck into this path of solitude, following its course beside the stream till the dark shapes of the 10 hatches cut the sheen thrown upon the river by the weak lustre that still lingered in the west. In a second or two he stood beside the weir hole where the water was at its deepest. He looked backwards and forwards, and no creature appeared in view. He then took off his coat and hat, and stood on the brink of the stream with his hands clasped in front of him. While his eyes were bent on the water beneath, there slowly became visible a something floating in the circular pool formed by the wash of centuries, the pool he was intending to make his death-bed. At first it was indistinct by reason of the shadow from the bank, but it emerged thence and took shape, which was that of a human body, lying stiff and stark upon the surface of the stream. In the circular current imparted by the central flow, the form was brought forward till it passed under his eyes, and then he perceived with a sense of horror that it was himself. Not a man somewhat resembling him, but one in all respects his counterpart, his actual double, was floating as if dead in 10 hatches whole. The sense of the supernatural was strong in this unhappy man, and he turned away as one might have done in the actual presence of an appalling miracle. He covered his eyes and bowed his head. Without looking again into the stream he took his coat and hat and went slowly away. Presently he found himself by the door of his own dwelling. To his surprise Elizabeth Jane was standing there. She came forward, spoke, called him father just as before. Newson, then, had not even yet returned. "I thought you seemed very sad this morning," she said, "so I have come again to see you. Not that I am anything but sad myself, but everybody and everything seem against you so, and I know you must be suffering." How this woman divined things! Yet she had not divined their whole extremity. He said to her, "Are miracles still worked, do ye think, Elizabeth? I am not a read man. I don't know so much as I could wish. I have tried to peruse and learn all my life, but the more I try to know, the more ignorant I seem. I don't quite think there are any miracles nowadays," she said. "No interference in the case of desperate intentions, for instance? Well, perhaps not, in a direct way, perhaps not. But will you come and walk with me, and I will show 'ee what I mean?" She agreed willingly, and he took her over the highway, and by the lonely path to 10 hatches. He walked restlessly, as if some haunting shade, unseen of her, hovered round him and troubled his glance. She would gladly have talked of Lucetta, but feared to disturb him. When they got near the weir he stood still, and asked her to go forward and look into the pool, and tell him what she saw. She went, and soon returned to him. "Nothing," she said. "Go again," said Henchard, "and look narrowly." She proceeded to the river brink a second time. On her return, after some delay, she told him that she saw something floating round and round there, but what it was she could not discern. It seemed to be a bundle of old clothes. "Are they like mine?" asked Henchard. "Well, they are. Dear me, I wonder if— Father, let us go away." "Go and look once more, and then we will get home." She went back, and he could see her stoop till her head was close to the margin of the pool. She started up and hastened back to his side. "Well," said Henchard, "what do you say now?" "Let us go home. But tell me, do, what is it floating there?" "The effigy," she answered hastily. "They must have thrown it into the river higher up amongst the willows at Blackwater to get rid of it in their alarm at discovery by the magistrates, and it must have floated down here." "Ah, to be sure, the image of me! But where is the other?" "Why, that one only. That performance of theirs killed her, but kept me alive." Elizabeth Jane thought and thought of these words, "kept me alive," as they slowly retraced their way to the town, and at length guessed their meaning. "Father, I will not leave you alone like this!" she cried. "May I live with you, and tend upon you as I used to do? I do not mind your being poor. I would have agreed to come this morning, but you did not ask me." "May you come to me?" he cried bitterly. "Elizabeth, don't mock me. If you only would come!" "I will," said she. "How will you forgive all my roughness in former days? You cannot." "I have forgotten it. Talk of that no more." Thus she assured him, and arranged their plans for reunion, and at length each went home. Then Henchard shaved for the first time during many days, and put on clean linen and combed his hair, and was as a man resuscitated thenceforward. The next morning The fact turned out to be as Elizabeth Jane had stated. The effigy was discovered by a cowherd, and that of Lucetta a little higher up in the same stream. But as little as possible was said of the matter, and the figures were privately destroyed. Despite this natural solution of the mystery, Henchard no less regarded it as an intervention that the figures should have been floating there. Elizabeth Jane heard him say, "Who is such a reprobate as I? And yet it seems that even I be in somebody's hand." End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of the Mayor of Casterbridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 42. But the emotional conviction that he was in somebody's hand began to die out of Henchard's breast as time slowly removed into distance the event which had given that feeling birth. The apparition of Newson haunted him. He would surely return. Yet Newson did not arrive. Lucetta had been borne along the churchyard path. Casterbridge had for the last time turned its regard upon her before proceeding to its work as if she had never lived. But Elizabeth remained undisturbed in the belief of her relationship to Henchard, and now shared his home. Perhaps, after all, Newson was gone forever. In due time the bereaved Farfrae had learnt the, at least proximate cause of Lucetta's illness and death, and his first impulse was, naturally enough, to wreak vengeance in the name of the law upon the perpetrators of the mischief. He resolved to wait till the funeral was over ere he moved in the matter. The time having come, he reflected. Disastrous as the result had been, it was obviously in no way foreseen or intended by the thoughtless crew who arranged the motley procession. The tempting prospect of putting to the blush people who stand at the head of affairs, that supreme and piquant enjoyment of those who writhe under the heel of the same, had alone animated them, so far as he could see, for he knew nothing of Jopp's incitements. Other considerations were also involved. Lucetta had confessed everything to him before her death, and it was not altogether desirable to make much ado about her history, alike for her sake, for Henchard's, and for his own. To regard the event as an untoward accident seemed to Farfrae truest consideration for the dead one's memory, as well as best philosophy. Henchard and himself mutually forbore to meet. For Elizabeth's sake the former had fettered his pride sufficiently to accept the small seed and root business which some of the town council, headed by Farfrae, had purchased to afford him a new opening. Had he been only personally concerned, Henchard without doubt would have declined assistance even remotely brought about by the man whom he had so fiercely assailed. But the sympathy of the girl seemed necessary to his very existence, and on her account pride itself wore the garments of humility. Here they settled themselves, and on each day of their lives Henchard anticipated her every wish with a watchfulness in which paternal regard was heightened by a burning jealous dread of rivalry. Yet that Newson would ever now return to Casterbridge to claim her as a daughter there was little reason to suppose. He was a wanderer and a stranger, almost an alien. He had not seen his daughter for several years. His affection for her could not, in the nature of things, be keen. Other interests would probably soon obscure his recollections of her, and prevent any such renewal of inquiry into the past as would lead to a discovery that she was still a creature of the present. To satisfy his conscience somewhat, Henchard repeated to himself that the lie which had retained for him the coveted treasure had not been deliberately told to that end, but had come from him as the last defiant word of a despair which took no thought of consequences. Furthermore, he pleaded within himself that no Newson could love her as he loved her, or would tend her to his life's extremity as he was prepared to do cheerfully. Thus they lived on in the shop overlooking the churchyard, and nothing occurred to mark their days during the remainder of the year. Going out but seldom, and never on a market day, they saw Donald Farfrae only at rarest intervals, and then mostly as a transitory object in the distance of the street. Yet he was pursuing his ordinary avocations, smiling mechanically to fellow tradesmen, and arguing with bargainers, as bereaved men do after a while. Time, in his own grey style, taught Farfrae how to estimate his experience of Lucetta, all that it was and all that it was not. There are men whose hearts insist upon a dogged fidelity to some image or cause thrown by chance into their keeping long after their judgment has pronounced it no rarity, even the reverse, indeed, and without them the band of the worthy is incomplete. But Farfrae was not one of those. It was inevitable that the insight, briskness, and rapidity of his nature should take him out of the dead blank which his loss threw about him. He could not but perceive that by the death of Lucetta he had exchanged a looming misery for a simple sorrow. After that revelation of her history, which must have come sooner or later in any circumstances, it was hard to believe that life with her would have been productive of further happiness. But as a memory, notwithstanding such conditions, Lucetta's image still lived on with him, her weaknesses provoking only the gentlest criticism, and her sufferings attenuating wrath at her concealments to a momentary spark now and then. By the end of a year Henchard's little retail seed and grain shop, not much larger than a cupboard, had developed its trade considerably, and the stepfather and daughter enjoyed much serenity in the pleasant sunny corner in which it stood. The quiet bearing of one who brimmed with an inner activity characterized Elizabeth Jane at this period. She took long walks into the country 2 or 3 times a week, mostly in the direction of Budmouth. Sometimes it occurred to him that when she sat with him in the evening, after those invigorating walks, she was civil rather than affectionate, and he was troubled. One more bitter regret being added to those he had already experienced at having, by his severe censorship, frozen up her precious affection when originally offered. She had her own way in everything now. In going and coming, in buying and selling, her word was law. "You have got a new muff, Elizabeth," he said to her one day quite humbly. "Yes, I bought it," she said. He looked at it again as it lay on an adjoining table. The fur was of a glossy brown, and though he was no judge of such articles, he thought it seemed an unusually good one for her to possess. "Rather costly, I suppose, my dear, was it not?" he hazarded. "It was rather above my figure," she said quietly, "but it is not showy." "Oh, no," said the netted lion, anxious not to pique her in the least. Some little time after, when the year had advanced into another spring, he paused opposite her empty bedroom in passing it. He thought of the time when she had cleared out of his then large and handsome house in Corn Street in consequence of his dislike and harshness, and he had looked into her chamber in just the same way. The present room was much humbler, but what struck him about it was the abundance of books lying everywhere. Their number and quality made the meagre furniture that supported them seem absurdly disproportionate. Some, indeed many, must have been recently purchased, and though he encouraged her to buy in reason, he had no notion that she indulged her innate passions so extensively in proportion to the narrowness of their income. For the first time he felt a little hurt by what he thought her extravagance, and resolved to say a word to her about it. But before he had found the courage to speak, an event happened which set his thoughts flying in quite another direction. The busy time of the seed trade was over, and the quiet weeks that preceded the hay season had come, setting their special stamp upon Casterbridge by thronging the market with wood rakes, new wagons in yellow, green, and red, formidable scythes, and pitchforks of prongs sufficient to skewer up a small family. Henchard, contrary to his wont, went out one Saturday afternoon towards the market-place from a curious feeling that he would like to pass a few minutes on the spot of his former triumphs. Farfrae, to whom he was still a comparative stranger, stood a few steps below the Corn Exchange door, a usual position with him at this hour, and he appeared lost in thought about something he was looking at a little way off. Henchard's eyes followed Farfrae's, and he saw that the object of his gaze was no sample-showing farmer, but his own stepdaughter, who had just come out of a shop over the way. She, on her part, was quite unconscious of his attention, and in this was less fortunate than those young women whose very plumes, like those of Juno's bird, are set with Argus eyes whenever possible admirers are within ken. Henchard went away, thinking that perhaps there was nothing significant after all in Farfrae's look at Elizabeth Jane at that juncture. Yet he could not forget that the Scotchman had once shown a tender interest in her, of a fleeting kind. Thereupon promptly came to the surface that idiosyncrasy of Henchard's which had ruled his courses from the beginning and had mainly made him what he was. Instead of thinking that a union between his cherished stepdaughter and the energetic, thriving Donald was a thing to be desired for her good and his own. He hated the very possibility. Time had been when such instinctive opposition would have taken shape in action, but he was not now the Henchard of former days. He schooled himself to accept her will, in this as in other matters, as absolute and unquestionable. He dreaded lest an antagonistic word should lose for him such regard as he had regained from her by his devotion, feeling that to retain this under separation was better than to incur her dislike by keeping her near. But the mere thought of such separation fevered his spirit much, and in the evening he said, with the stillness of suspense, "Have you seen Mr. Farfrae to-day, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth Jane started at the question, and it was with some confusion that she replied, "No." "Oh, that's right, that's right. It was only that I saw him in the street when we both were there." He was wondering if her embarrassment justified him in a new suspicion, that the long walks which she had latterly been taking, that the new books which had so surprised him, had anything to do with the young man. She did not enlighten him, and lest silence should allow her to shape thoughts unfavourable to their present friendly relations, he diverted the discourse into another channel. Henchard was, by original make, the last man to act stealthily, for good or for evil. But the solicitous timor of his love, the dependence upon Elizabeth's regard into which he had declined, or in another sense to which he had advanced, denaturalized him. He would often weigh and consider for hours together the meaning of such and such a deed or phrase of hers, when a blunt settling question would formerly have been his first instinct. And now, uneasy at the thought of a passion for Farfrae which should entirely displace her mild filial sympathy with himself, he observed her going and coming more narrowly. There was nothing secret in Elizabeth Jane's movements beyond what habitual reserve induced, and it may at once be owned on her account that she was guilty of occasional conversations with Donald when they chanced to meet. Whatever the origin of her walks on the Budmouth road, her return from those walks was often coincident with Farfrae's emergence from Corn Street for a 20 minutes' blow on that rather windy highway, just to winnow the seeds and chaff out of him before sitting down to tea, as he said. Henchard became aware of this by going to the ring, and screened by its enclosure, keeping his eye upon the road till he saw them meet. His face assumed an expression of extreme anguish. "Of her too he means to rob me," he whispered. "But he has the right. I do not wish to interfere." The meeting, in truth, was of a very innocent kind, and matters were by no means so far advanced between the young people as Henchard's jealous grief inferred. Could he have heard such conversation as passed he would have been enlightened thus much. He: "You like walking this way, Miss Henchard? And is it not so?" uttered in his undulatory accents and with an appraising, pondering gaze at her. She: "Oh yes, I have chosen this road latterly. I have no great reason for it." He: "But that may make a reason for others." She, reddening: "I don't know that. My reason, however, such as it is that I wish to get a glimpse of the sea every day." He: "Is it a secret why?" She, reluctantly: "Yes." He, with the pathos of one of his native ballads: "Ah, I doubt there will be any good in secrets. A secret cast a deep shadow over my life, and well you know what it was." Elizabeth admitted that she did, but she refrained from confessing why the sea attracted her. She could not herself account for it fully, not knowing the secret possibly to be that in addition to early marine associations her blood was a sailor's. "Thank you for those new books, Mr. Farfrae," she added shyly. "I wonder if I ought to accept so many." Why not? It gives me more pleasure to get them for you than you to have them." "It cannot." They proceeded along the road together till they reached the town, and their paths diverged. Henchard vowed that he would leave them to their own devices, put nothing in the way of their courses, whatever they might mean. If he were doomed to be bereft of her, so it must be. In the situation which their marriage would create he could see no locus standi for himself at all. Farfrae would never recognize him more than superciliously. His poverty ensured that, no less than his past conduct. And so Elizabeth would grow to be a stranger to him, and the end of his life would be friendless solitude. With such a possibility impending he could not help watchfulness. Indeed, within certain lines he had the right to keep an eye upon her as his charge. The meetings seemed to become matters of course with them on special days of the week. At last full proof was given him. He was standing behind a wall close to the place at which Farfrae encountered her. He heard the young man address her as "Dearest Elizabeth Jane," and then kiss her, the girl looking quickly round to assure herself that nobody was near. When they were gone their way, Henchard came out from the wall and mournfully followed them to Casterbridge. The chief looming trouble in this engagement had not decreased. Both Farfrae and Elizabeth Jane, unlike the rest of the people, must suppose Elizabeth to be his actual daughter, from his own assertion, while he himself had the same belief. And though Farfrae must have so far forgiven him as to have no objection to own him as a father-in-law, intimate they could never be. Thus would the girl, who was his only friend, be withdrawn from him by degrees through her husband's influence, and learn to despise him. Had she lost her heart to any other man in the world than the one he had rivaled, cursed, wrestled with for life in days before his spirit was broken, Henchard would have said, "I am content." But content with the prospect as now depicted was hard to acquire. There is an outer chamber of the brain in which thoughts, unowned, unsolicited, and of noxious kind, are sometimes allowed to wander for a moment prior to being sent off whence they came. One of these thoughts sailed into Henchard's ken now. Suppose he were to communicate to Farfrae the fact that his betrothed was not the child of Michael Henchard at all, legally nobody's child. How would that correct and leading townsman receive the information? He might possibly forsake Elizabeth Jane, and then she would be her stepsire's own again. Henchard shuddered and exclaimed, "God forbid such a thing! Why should I still be subject to these visitations of the devil when I try so hard to keep him away?" End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of the Mayor of Casterbridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 43. What Henchard saw thus early was, naturally enough, seen at a little later date by other people. That Mr. Farfrae walked with that bankrupt Henchard's stepdaughter of all women became a common topic in the town, the simple perambulating term being used hereabout to signify a wooing, and the 19 superior young ladies of Casterbridge, who had each looked upon herself as the only woman capable of making the merchant councilman happy, indignantly left off going to the church Farfrae attended, left off conscious mannerisms, left off putting him in their prayers at night amongst their blood relations, in short, reverted to their normal courses. Perhaps the only inhabitants of the town to whom this looming choice of the Scotchman's gave unmixed satisfaction were the members of the philosophic party, which included Longways, Christopher Coney, Billy Wills, Mr. Busford, and the like. The three mariners having been, years before, the house in which they had witnessed the young man and woman's first and humble appearance on the Casterbridge stage, they took a kindly interest in their career, not unconnected, perhaps, with visions of festive treatment at their hands hereafter. Mrs. Stannage having rolled into the large parlour one evening and said that it was a wonder such a man as Mr. Farfrae, a pillow of the town, who might have chosen one of the daughters of the professional men or private residents, should stoop so low. Coney ventured to disagree with her. "No, ma'am, no wonder at all. 'Tis she that's a stooping to he, that's my opinion. A widow man whose first wife was no credit to him, what is it for a young pursuing woman that's her own mistress and well liked? But as a neat patching up of things I see much good in it. When a man have put up a tomb of best marble stone to the other one, as he've done, and weeped his fill and thought it all over, and said to hisself, 'T'other took me in, I knowed this one first. She's a sensible piece for a partner, and there's no faithful woman in high life now.' Well, he may do worse than not to take her, if she's tender inclined." Thus they talked at the Mariners, but we must guard against the too liberal use of the conventional declaration that a great sensation was caused by the prospective event, that all the gossips' tongues were set wagging thereby, and so on, even though such a declaration might lend some eclat to the career of our poor only heroine. When all has been said about busy rumourers, a superficial and temporary thing is the interest of anybody in affairs which do not directly touch them. It would be a truer representation to say that Casterbridge, ever excepting the 19 young ladies, looked up for a moment at the news, and withdrawing its attention went on labouring and victualling, bringing up its children and burying its dead without caring a tittle for Farfrae's domestic plans. Not a hint of the matter was thrown out to her stepfather by Elizabeth herself, or by Farfrae either. Reasoning on the cause of their reticence, he concluded that, estimating him by his past, the throbbing pair were afraid to broach the subject, and looked upon him as an irksome obstacle whom they would be heartily glad to get out of the way. Embittered as he was against society, this moody view of himself took deeper and deeper hold of Henchard, till the daily necessity of facing mankind, and of them, particularly Elizabeth Jane, became well nigh more than he could endure. His health declined, he became morbidly sensitive, he wished he could escape those who did not want him, and hide his head for ever. But what if he were mistaken in his views, and there were no necessity that his own absolute separation from her should be involved in the incident of her marriage? He proceeded to draw a picture of the alternative, himself living like a fangless lion about the back rooms of a house in which his stepdaughter was mistress, an inoffensive old man, tenderly smiled on by Elizabeth, and good-naturedly tolerated by her husband. It was terrible to his pride to think of descending so low, and yet for the girl's sake he might put up with anything, even from Farfrae, even snubbings and masterful tongue-scourgings. The privilege of being in the house she occupied would almost outweigh the personal humiliation. Whether this were a dim possibility or the reverse, the courtship, which it evidently now was, had an absorbing interest for him. Elizabeth, as has been said, often took her walks on the Budmouth road, and Farfrae as often made it convenient to create an accidental meeting with her there. 2 miles out, a quarter of a mile from the highway, was the prehistoric fort called Maydun, of huge dimensions and many ramparts, within or upon whose enclosures a human being, as seen from the road, was but an insignificant speck. Hitherward Henchard often resorted, glass in hand, and scanned the hedgeless via, for it was the original track laid out by the legions of the Empire, to a distance of 2 or 3 miles, his object being to read the progress of affairs between Farfrae and his charmer. One day Henchard was at this spot when a masculine figure came along the road from Budmouth and lingered. Applying his telescope to his eye, Henchard expected that Farfrae's features would be disclosed as usual, but the lenses revealed that today the man was not Elizabeth Jane's lover. It was one clothed as a merchant captain, and as he turned in the scrutiny of the road he revealed his face. Henchard lived a lifetime the moment he saw it. The face was Newson's. Henchard dropped the glass, and for some seconds made no other movement. Newson waited, and Henchard waited, if that could be called a waiting, which was a transfixture. But Elizabeth Jane did not come. Something or other had caused her to neglect her customary walk that day. Perhaps Farfrae and she had chosen another road for variety's sake. But what did that amount to? She might be here tomorrow, and in any case Newson, if bent on a private meeting and a revelation of the truth to her, would soon make his opportunity. Then he would tell her not only of his paternity, but of the ruse by which he had been once sent away. Elizabeth's strict nature would cause her for the first time to despise her stepfather, would root out his image as that of an arch deceiver, and Newson would reign in her heart in his stead. But Newson did not see anything of her that morning. Having stood still a while, he at last retraced his steps, and Henchard felt like a condemned man who has a few hours' respite. When he reached his own house he found her there. "Oh, father," she said innocently, "I have had a letter, a strange one, not signed. Somebody has asked me to meet him, either on the Budmouth road at noon to-day, or in the evening at Mr. Farfrae's. He says he came to see me some time ago, but a trick was played on him, so that he did not see me. I don't understand it, but between you and me I think Donald is at the bottom of the mystery, and that it is a relation of his who wants to pass an opinion on his choice. But I did not like to go till I had seen you. Shall I go?" Henchard replied heavily, "Yes, go." The question of his remaining in Casterbridge was forever disposed of by this closing in of Newson on the scene. Henchard was not the man to stand the certainty of condemnation on a matter so near his heart, and being an old hand at bearing anguish in silence, and haughty withal, he resolved to make as light as he could of his intentions, while immediately taking his measures. He surprised the young woman whom he had looked upon as his all in this world, by saying to her, as if he did not care about her more, "I am going to leave Casterbridge, Elizabeth Jane." "Leave Casterbridge!" she cried. "And leave me?" "Yes, this little shop can be managed by you alone, as well as by us both. I don't care about shops and streets and folk. I would rather get into the country by myself, out of sight, and follow my own ways, and leave you to yours." She looked down, and her tears fell silently. It seemed to her that this resolve of his had come on account of her attachment and its probable result. She showed her devotion to Farfrae, however, by mastering her emotion and speaking out. "I am sorry you have decided on this," she said with difficult firmness, "for I thought it possible, that I might marry Mr. Farfrae some little time hence, and I did not know that you disapproved of the step." "I approve of anything you desire to do, Izzy," said Henchard huskily. "If I did not approve it would be no matter. I wish to go away. My presence might make things awkward in the future, and in short it is best that I go." Nothing that her affection could urge would induce him to reconsider his determination, for she could not urge what she did not know, that when she should learn he was not related to her other than as a step-parent, she would refrain from despising him, and that when she knew what he had done to keep her in ignorance she would refrain from hating him. It was his conviction that she would not so refrain, and there existed as yet neither word nor event which could argue it away. "Then," she said at last, "you will not be able to come to my wedding, and that is not as it ought to be." "I don't want to see it, I don't want to see it!" he exclaimed, adding more softly, "But think of me sometimes in your future life. You'll do that, Izzy? Think of me when you are living as the wife of the richest, the foremost man in the town, and don't let my sins, when you know them all, cause 'ee to quite forget that, though I loved 'ee late, I loved 'ee well." "It is because of Donald," she sobbed. "I don't forbid you to marry him," said Henchard. "Promise not to quite forget me when—" he meant when Newson should come. She promised mechanically in her agitation, and the same evening at dusk Henchard left the town, to whose development he had been one of the chief stimulants for many years. During the day he had bought a new tool basket, cleaned up his old hay knife and wimble, set himself up in fresh leggings, knee naps and corduroys, and in other ways gone back to the working clothes of his young manhood, discarding for ever the shabby genteel suit of cloth and rusty silk hat that since his decline had characterized him in the Casterbridge street as a man who had seen better days. He went secretly and alone, not a soul of the many who had known him being aware of his departure. Elizabeth Jane accompanied him as far as the second bridge on the highway, for the hour of her appointment with the unguessed visitor at Farfrae's had not yet arrived, and parted from him with unfeigned wonder and sorrow, keeping him back a minute or two before finally letting him go. She watched his form diminish across the moor, the yellow rush basket at his back moving up and down with each tread, and the creases behind his knees coming and going alternately till she could no longer see them. Though she did not know it, Henchard formed at this moment much the same picture as he had presented when entering Casterbridge for the first time nearly a quarter of a century before, except, to be sure, that the serious addition to his years had considerably lessened the spring to his stride, that his state of hopelessness had weakened him and imparted to his shoulders, as weighted by the basket, a perceptible bend. He went on till he came to the first milestone, which stood in the bank, half-way up a steep hill. He rested his basket on the top of the stone, placed his elbows on it, and gave way to a convulsive twitch, which was worse than a sob, because it was so hard and so dry. "If I had only got her with me, if I only had," he said. "Hard work would be nothing to me then. But that was not to be. I, Cain, go alone as I deserve, an outcast and a vagabond. But my punishment is not greater than I can bear." He sternly subdued his anguish, shouldered his basket, and went on. Elizabeth in the meantime had breathed him a sigh, recovered her equanimity, and turned her face to Casterbridge. Before she had reached the first house she was met in her walk by Donald Farfrae. This was evidently not their first meeting that day. They joined hands without ceremony, and Farfrae anxiously asked, "And is he gone? And did you tell him? "I mean of the other matter, not of ours?" "He is gone, and I told him all I knew of your friend, Donald. Who is he?" "Well, well, dearie, you will know soon about that, and Mr. Henchard will hear of it if he does not go far." "He will go far. He's bent upon getting out of sight and sound." She walked beside her lover, and when they reached the crossways or bow, turned with him into Corn Street instead of going straight on to her own door. At Farfrae's house they stopped and went in. Farfrae flung open the door of the ground-floor sitting-room, saying, "There he is, waiting for you," and Elizabeth entered. In the armchair sat the broad-faced, genial man who had called on Henchard on a memorable morning between 1 and 2 years before this time, and whom the latter had seen mount the coach and depart within half an hour of his arrival. It was Richard Newson. The meeting with the light-hearted father from whom she had been separated half a dozen years, as if by death, need hardly be detailed. It was an affecting one, apart from the question of paternity. Henchard's departure was in a moment explained. When the true facts came to be handled, the difficulty of restoring her to her old belief in Newson was not so great as might have seemed likely, for Henchard's conduct itself was a proof that those facts were true. Moreover, she had grown up under Newson's paternal care, and even had Henchard been her father in nature, this father in early domiciliation might almost have carried the point against him, when the incidents of her parting with Henchard had a little worn off. Newson's pride in what she had grown up to be was more than he could express. He kissed her again and again. "I've saved you the trouble to come and meet me, ha ha," said Newson. "The fact is that Mr. Farfrae here, he said, 'Come up and stop with me for a day or two, Captain Newson, and I'll bring her round.' Faith, says I, so I will, and here I am." "Well, Henchard is gone," said Farfrae, shutting the door. "He has done it all voluntarily, and, as I gather from Elizabeth, he has been very nice with her. I was got rather uneasy, but all is as it should be, and we will have no more difficulties at all." "Now that's very much as I thought," said Newson, looking into the face of each by turns. "I said to myself, 100 times, when I tried to get a peep at her unknown to herself, depend upon it, 'tis best that I should live on quiet for a few days like this, till something turns up for the better. I now know you are all right, and what can I wish for more?" "Well, Captain Newson, I will be glad to see ye here every day now, since it can do no harm," said Farfrae. "And what I've been thinking is that the wedding may as well be kept under my own roof, the house being large, and you being in lodgings by yourself, so that a great deal of trouble and expense would be saved ye. And 'tis a convenience when a couple's married not to have far to go to get home." "With all my heart," said Captain Newson, "since, as ye say, it can do no harm now poor Henchard's gone, though I wouldn't have done it otherwise, or put myself in his way at all, for I've already in my lifetime been an intruder into his family quite as far as politeness can be expected to put up with. But what did the young woman say herself about it? Elizabeth, my child, come and hearken to what we be talking about, and not bide staring out of the window as if ye didn't hear." "Donald and you must settle it," murmured Elizabeth, still keeping up a scrutinizing gaze at some small object in the street. "Well then," continued Newson, turning anew to Farfrae, with a face expressing thorough entry into the subject, "that's how we'll have it. And, Mr. Farfrae, as you provide so much, and house room and all that, I'll do my part in the drinkables, and see to the rum and scheidam. Maybe a dozen jars will be sufficient, as many of the folk will be ladies, and perhaps they won't drink hard enough to make a high average in the reckoning. But you know best. I've provided for men and shipmates times enough, but I'm as ignorant as a child how many glasses of grog a woman that's not a drinking woman is expected to consume at these ceremonies." "Oh, none. We'll no want much of that. Oh no," said Farfrae, shaking his head with appalled gravity. "Do you leave all to me." When they had gone a little further in these particulars, Newson, leaning back in his chair and smiling reflectively at the ceiling, said, "I've never told ye, or have I, Mr. Farfrae, how Henchard put me off the scent that time?" He expressed ignorance of what the captain alluded to. "Ah, I thought I hadn't. I resolved that I would not, I remember, not to hurt the man's name. But now he's gone, I can tell ye. Why, I came to Casterbridge 9 or 10 months before that day last week that I found ye out. I had been here twice before then. The first time I passed through the town on my way westward, not knowing Elizabeth lived here. Then, hearing at some place, I forget where, that a man of the name of Henchard had been mayor here, I came back and called at his house one morning. The old rascal! He said Elizabeth Jane had died years ago." Elizabeth now gave earnest heed to his story. "No, it never crossed my mind that the man was selling me a packet," continued Newson. "And if you'll believe me, I was that upset that I went back to the coach that had brought me, and took passage onward without lying in the town half an hour. Ha ha! 'Twas a good joke, and well carried out, and I give the man credit for't." Elizabeth Jane was amazed at the intelligence. "A joke? Oh no!" she cried. "Then he kept you from me, father, all those months when you might have been here?" The father admitted that such was the case. "He ought not to have done it," said Farfrae. Elizabeth sighed. "I said I would never forget him. But oh, I think I ought to forget him now." Newson, like a good many rovers and sojourners among strange men and strange moralities, failed to perceive the enormity of Henchard's crime, notwithstanding that he himself had been the chief sufferer therefrom. Indeed, the attack upon the absent culprit waxing serious, he began to take Henchard's part. "Well, 'twas not 10 words that he said, after all," Newson pleaded. "And how could he know that I should be such a simpleton as to believe him? 'Twas as much my fault as his, poor fellow." "No," said Elizabeth Jane firmly, in her revulsion of feeling. "He knew your disposition. You always were so trusting, father. I've heard my mother say so hundreds of times. And he did it to wrong you. After weaning me from you these 5 years by saying he was my father, he should not have done this." Thus they conversed, and there was nobody to set before Elizabeth any extenuation of the absent one's deceit. Even had he been present, Henchard might scarce have pleaded it, so little did he value himself or his good name. "Well, well, never mind, it is all over and past," said Newson good-naturedly. "Now about this wedding again." End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of the Mayor of Casterbridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 44. Meanwhile the man of their talk had pursued his solitary way eastward till weariness overtook him, and he looked about for a place of rest. His heart was so exacerbated at parting from the girl that he could not face an inn, or even a household of the most humble kind, and entering a field he lay down under a wheat-rick, feeling no want of food. The very heaviness of his soul caused him to sleep profoundly. The bright autumn sun, shining into his eyes across the stubble, awoke him the next morning early. He opened his basket and ate for his breakfast what he had packed for his supper, and in doing so overhauled the remainder of his kit. Although everything he brought necessitated carriage at his own back, he had secreted among his tools a few of Elizabeth Jane's cast-off belongings, in the shape of gloves, shoes, a scrap of her handwriting, and the like, and in his pocket he carried a curl of her hair. Having looked at these things he closed them up again and went onward. During 5 consecutive days Henchard's rush basket rode along upon his shoulder between the highway hedges, the new yellow of the rushes catching the eye of an occasional field labourer as he glanced through the quickset, together with the wayfarer's hat and head and downturned face, over which the twig shadows moved in endless procession. It now became apparent that the direction of his journey was Weydon Priors, which he reached on the afternoon of the 6th day. The renowned hill whereon the annual fair had been held for so many generations was now bare of human beings, and almost of aught besides. A few sheep grazed thereabout, but these ran off when Henchard halted upon the summit. He deposited his basket upon the turf and looked about with sad curiosity, till he discovered the road by which his wife and himself had entered on the upland so memorable to both 25 years before. "Yes, we came up that way," he said, after ascertaining his bearings. "She was carrying the baby, and I was reading a ballot sheet. Then we crossed about here, she so sad and weary, and I speaking to her hardly at all because of my cursed pride and mortification at being poor. Then we saw the tent. That must have stood more this way." He walked to another spot. It was not really where the tent had stood, but it seemed so to him. "Here we went in, and here we sat down. I faced this way, then I drank and committed my crime. It must have been just on that very pixie ring that she was standing when she said her last words to me before going off with him. I can hear their sound now, and the sound of her sobs. Oh, Mike, I've lived with thee all this while and had nothing but temper. Now I'm no more to 'ee. I'll try my luck elsewhere." He experienced not only the bitterness of a man who finds, in looking back upon an ambitious course, that what he has sacrificed in sentiment was worth as much as what he has gained in substance, but the superadded bitterness of seeing his very recantation nullified. He had been sorry for all this long ago, but his attempts to replace ambition by love had been as fully foiled as his ambition itself. His wronged wife had foiled them by a fraud so grandly simple as to be almost a virtue. It was an odd sequence that out of all this tampering with social law came that flower of nature, Elizabeth. Part of his wish to wash his hands of life arose from his perception of its contrarious inconsistencies, of nature's jaunty readiness to support unorthodox social principles. He intended to go on from this place, visited as an act of penance, into another part of the country altogether, but he could not help thinking of Elizabeth and the quarter of the horizon in which she lived. Out of this it happened that the centrifugal tendency imparted by weariness of the world was counteracted by the centripetal influence of his love for his stepdaughter. As a consequence, instead of following a straight course yet further away from Casterbridge, Henchard gradually, almost unconsciously, deflected from that right line of his first intention, till by degrees his wandering, like that of the Canadian woodsman, became part of a circle of which Casterbridge formed the centre. In ascending any particular hill he ascertained the bearings as nearly as he could by means of the sun, moon, or stars, and settled in his mind the exact direction in which Casterbridge and Elizabeth Jane lay. Sneering at himself for his weakness, he yet every hour, nay, every few minutes, conjectured her actions for the time being, her sitting down and rising up, her goings and comings, till thought of Newson's and Farfrae's counter-influence would pass like a cold blast over a pool and efface her image. And then he would say to himself, "Oh, you fool! All this about a daughter who is no daughter of thine!" At length he obtained employment at his own occupation of hay-trusser, work of that sort being in demand at this autumn time. The scene of his hiring was a pastoral farm near the old western highway, whose course was the channel of all such communications as passed between the busy centres of novelty and the remote Wessex boroughs. He had chosen the neighbourhood of this artery from a sense that, situated here, though at a distance of 50 miles, he was virtually nearer to her whose welfare was so dear than he would be at a roadless spot only half as remote. And thus Henchard found himself again on the precise standing which he had occupied a quarter of a century before. Externally there was nothing to hinder his making another start on the upward slope, and by his new lights achieving higher things than his soul in its half-formed state had been able to accomplish. But the ingenious machinery contrived by the gods for reducing human possibilities of amelioration to a minimum, which arranges that wisdom to do shall come pari passu with the departure of zest for doing, stood in the way of all that. He had no wish to make an arena a second time of a world that had become a mere painted scene to him. Very often, as his hay-knife crunched down among the sweet-smelling grassy stems, he would survey mankind and say to himself, "Here and everywhere be folk dying before their time like frosted leaves, though wanted by their families, the country, and the world, while I, an outcast, an encumberer of the ground, wanted by nobody and despised by all, live on against my will." He often kept an eager ear upon the conversations of those who passed along the road, not from a general curiosity by any means, but in the hope that among these travellers between Casterbridge and London some would, sooner or later, speak of the former place. The distance, however, was too great to lend much probability to his desire, and the highest result of his attention to wayside words was that he did indeed hear the name Casterbridge uttered one day by the driver of a road waggon. Henchard ran to the gate of the field he worked in, and hailed the speaker, who was a stranger. "Yes, I've come from there, maister," he said, in answer to Henchard's inquiry. "I trade up and down, ye know, though. What with this travelling without horses that's getting so common, my work will soon be done." "Anything moving in the old place, mid I ask?" "All the same as usual. I've heard that Mr. Farfrae, the late mayor, is thinking of getting married. Now is that true or not?" "I couldn't say for the life o' me." "Oh no, I should think not." "But yes, John, you forget," said a woman inside the waggon tilt. "What were them packages we carried there at the beginning of the week? Surely they said a wedding was coming off soon, on Martin's Day?" The man declared he remembered nothing about it, and the waggon went on jangling over the hill. Henchard was convinced that the woman's memory served her well. The date was an extremely probable one, there being no reason for delay on either side. He might, for that matter, write and inquire of Elizabeth, but his instinct for sequestration had made the course difficult. Yet before he left her she had said that for him to be absent from her wedding was not as she wished it to be. The remembrance would continually revive in him now that it was not Elizabeth and Farfrae who had driven him away from them, but his own haughty sense that his presence was no longer desired. He had assumed the return of Newson without absolute proof that the captain meant to return, still less that Elizabeth Jane would welcome him, and with no proof whatever that if he did return he would stay. What if he had been mistaken in his views? If there had been no necessity that his own absolute separation from her he loved should be involved in these untoward incidents? To make one more attempt to be near her, to go back, to see her, to plead his cause before her, to ask forgiveness for his fraud, to endeavour strenuously to hold his own in her love, it was worth the risk of repulse, of life itself. But how to initiate this reversal of all his former resolves without causing husband and wife to despise him for his inconsistency was a question which made him tremble and brood. He cut and cut his trusses 2 days more, and then he concluded his hesitancies by a sudden reckless determination to go to the wedding festivity. Neither writing nor message would be expected of him. She had regretted his decision to be absent. His unanticipated presence would fill the little unsatisfied corner that would probably have place in her just heart without him. To intrude as little of his personality as possible upon a gay event with which that personality could show nothing in keeping, he decided not to make his appearance till evening, when stiffness would have worn off, and a gentle wish to let bygones be bygones would exercise its sway in all hearts. He started on foot 2 mornings before St. Martin's tide, allowing himself about 16 miles to perform for each of the 3 days' journey, reckoning the wedding day as one. There were only 2 towns, Melchester and Shottsford, of any importance along his course, and at the latter he stopped on the second night, not only to rest, but to prepare himself for the next evening. Possessing no clothes but the working suit he stood in, now stained and distorted by their 2 months of hard usage, he entered a shop to make some purchases which should put him, externally at any rate, a little in harmony with the prevailing tone of the morrow. A rough yet respectable coat and hat, a new shirt and neckcloth were the chief of these, and having satisfied himself that in appearance at least he would not now offend her, he proceeded to the more interesting particular of buying her some present. What should that present be? He walked up and down the street, regarding dubiously the display in the shop windows, from a gloomy sense that what he might most like to give her would be beyond his miserable pocket. At length a caged goldfinch met his eye. The cage was a plain and small one, the shop humble, and on inquiry he concluded he could afford the modest sum asked. A sheet of newspaper was tied round the little creature's wire prison, and with the wrapped-up cage in his hand Henchard sought a lodging for the night. Next day he set out upon the last stage, and was soon within the district which had been his dealing ground in bygone years. Part of the distance he travelled by carrier, seating himself in the darkest corner at the back of that trader's van, and as the other passengers, mainly women going short journeys, mounted and alighted in front of Henchard, they talked over much local news, not the least portion of this being the wedding then in course of celebration at the town they were nearing. It appeared from their accounts that the town band had been hired for the evening party, and lest the convivial instincts of that body should get the better of their skill, the further step had been taken of engaging the string band from Budmouth, so that there would be a reserve of harmony to fall back upon in case of need. He heard, however, but few particulars beyond those known to him already, the incident of the deepest interest on the journey being the soft pealing of the Casterbridge bells, which reached the travellers' ears while the van paused on the top of Yalbury Hill to have the drag lowered. The time was just after 12 o'clock. Those notes were a signal that all had gone well, that there had been no slip twixt cup and lip in this case, that Elizabeth Jane and Donald Farfrae were man and wife. Henchard did not care to ride any further with his chattering companions after hearing this sound. Indeed, it quite unmanned him, and in pursuance of his plan of not showing himself in Casterbridge Street till evening, lest he should mortify Farfrae and his bride, he alighted here with his bundle and birdcage, and was soon left as a lonely figure on the broad white highway. It was the hill near which he had waited to meet Farfrae almost 2 years earlier to tell him of the serious illness of his wife Lucetta. The place was unchanged. The same larches sighed the same notes, but Farfrae had another wife, and, as Henchard knew, a better one. He only hoped that Elizabeth Jane had obtained a better home than had been hers at the former time. He passed the remainder of the afternoon in a curious high-strung condition, unable to do much but think of the approaching meeting with her, and sadly satirize himself for his emotions thereon as a Samson shorn. Such an innovation on Casterbridge customs as the flitting of bridegroom and bride from the town immediately after the ceremony was not likely, but if it should have taken place he would wait till their return. To assure himself on this point he asked the market-man, when near the borough, if the newly married couple had gone away, and was promptly informed that they had not. They were at that hour, according to all accounts, entertaining a houseful of guests at their home in Corn Street. Henchard dusted his boots, washed his hands at the riverside, and proceeded up the town under the feeble lamps. He need have made no inquiries beforehand, for on drawing near Farfrae's residence it was plain to the least observant that festivity prevailed within, and that Donald himself shared it, his voice being distinctly audible in the street, giving strong expression to a song of his dear native country that he loved so well as never to have revisited it. Idlers were standing on the pavement in front, and wishing to escape the notice of these, Henchard passed quickly on to the door. It was wide open. The hall was lighted extravagantly, and people were going up and down the stairs. His courage failed him. To enter footsore, laden, and poorly dressed into the midst of such resplendency was to bring needless humiliation upon her he loved, if not to court repulse from her husband. Accordingly he went round into the street at the back that he knew so well, entered the garden, and came quietly into the house through the kitchen, temporarily depositing the bird and cage under a bush outside to lessen the awkwardness of his arrival. Solitude and sadness had so immolated Henchard that he now feared circumstances he would formerly have scorned, and he began to wish that he had not taken upon himself to arrive at such a juncture. However, his progress was made unexpectedly easy by his discovering alone in the kitchen an elderly woman who seemed to be acting as provisional housekeeper during the convulsions from which Farfrae's establishment was just then suffering. She was one of those people whom nothing surprises, and though to her, a total stranger, his request must have seemed odd, she willingly volunteered to go up and inform the master and mistress of the house that a humble old friend had come. On second thought she said that he had better not wait in the kitchen, but come up into the little back parlour, which was empty. He thereupon followed her thither, and she left him. Just as she got across the landing to the door of the best parlour, a dance was struck up, and she returned to say that she would wait till that was over before announcing him, Mr. and Mrs. Farfrae having both joined in the figure. The door of the front room had been taken off its hinges to give more space, and that of the room Henchard sat in being ajar, he could see fractional parts of the dancers whenever their gyrations brought them near the doorway, chiefly in the shape of the skirts of dresses and streaming curls of hair, together with about 3/5 of the band in profile, including the restless shadow of a fiddler's elbow and the tip of the bass viol bow. The gaiety jarred upon Henchard's spirits, and he could not quite understand why Farfrae, a much sobered man and a widower, who had had his trials, should have cared for it all, notwithstanding the fact that he was quite a young man still, and quickly kindled to enthusiasm by dance and song. That the quiet Elizabeth, who had long ago appraised life at a moderate value, and who knew in spite of her maidenhood that marriage was as a rule no dancing matter, should have had zest for this revelry surprised him still more. However, young people could not be quite old people, he concluded, and custom was omnipotent. With the progress of the dance the performers spread out somewhat, and then for the first time he caught a glimpse of the once despised daughter who had mastered him and made his heart ache. She was in a dress of white silk or satin, he was not near enough to say which, snowy white without a tinge of milk or cream, and the expression of her face was one of nervous pleasure rather than of gaiety. Presently Farfrae came round, his exuberant Scotch movement making him conspicuous in a moment. The pair were not dancing together, but Henchard could discern that whenever the chances of the figure made them the partners of a moment, their emotions breathed a much subtler essence than at other times. By degrees Henchard became aware that the measure was trod by someone who out-farfrayed Farfrae in saltatory intenseness. This was strange, and it was stranger to find that the eclipsing personage was Elizabeth Jane's partner. The first time that Henchard saw him he was sweeping grandly round, his head quivering and low down, his legs in the form of an X and his back towards the door. The next time he came round in the other direction, his white waistcoat preceding his face, and his toes preceding his white waistcoat. That happy face, Henchard's complete discomfiture lay in it. It was Newson's, who had indeed come and supplanted him. Henchard pushed to the door, and for some seconds made no other movement. He rose to his feet and stood like a dark ruin, obscured by the shade from his own soul upthrown. But he was no longer the man to stand these reverses unmoved. His agitation was great, and he would fain have been gone, but before he could leave the dance had ended. The housekeeper had informed Elizabeth Jane of the stranger who awaited her, and she entered the room immediately. "Oh, it is Mr. Henchard," she said, starting back. "What, Elizabeth?" he cried, as he seized her hand. "What do you say, Mr. Henchard? Don't scourge me like that. Call me worthless old Henchard, anything, but don't 'ee be so cold as this. Oh, my maid, I see you have another, a real father in my place. Then you know all. But don't give all your thought to him. Do ye save a little room for me." She flushed up and gently drew her hand away. "I could have loved you always. I would have gladly," she said. "But how can I when I know you have deceived me so bitterly deceived me? You persuaded me that my father was not my father, allowed me to live on in ignorance of the truth for years, and then, when he, my warm-hearted real father, came to find me, cruelly sent him away with a wicked invention of my death which nearly broke his heart. Oh, how can I love as I once did a man who has served us like this?" Henchard's lips half parted to begin an explanation, but he shut them up like a vice and uttered not a sound. How should he there and then set before her with any effect the palliatives of his great faults? That he had himself been deceived in her identity at first, till informed by her mother's letter that his own child had died. That in the second accusation his lie had been the last desperate throw of a gamester who loved her affection better than his own honour. Among the many hindrances to such a pleading not the least was this, that he did not sufficiently value himself to lessen his sufferings by strenuous appeal or elaborate argument. Waiving, therefore, his privilege of self-defence, he regarded only his discomposure. "Don't ye distress yourself on my account," he said with proud superiority. "I would not wish it, at such a time, too, as this. I have done wrong in coming to 'ee, I see my error, but it is only for once, so forgive it. I'll never trouble 'ee again, Elizabeth Jane. No, not to my dying day. Good night, good-bye." Then, before she could collect her thoughts, Henchard went out from her rooms and departed from the house by the back way as he had come, and she saw him no more. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of the Mayor of Casterbridge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 45. It was about a month after the day which closed as in the last chapter. Elizabeth Jane had grown accustomed to the novelty of her situation, and the only difference between Donald's movements now and formerly was that he hastened indoors rather more quickly after business hours than he had been in the habit of doing for some time. Newson had stayed in Casterbridge 3 days after the wedding party, whose gaiety, as might have been surmised, was of his making rather than of the married couple's, and was stared at and honoured as became the returned Crusoe of the hour. But whether or not because Casterbridge was difficult to excite by dramatic returns and disappearances through having been for centuries an assize town, in which sensational exits from the world, antipodean absences, and such like were half-yearly occurrences, The inhabitants did not altogether lose their equanimity on his account. On the fourth morning he was discovered disconsolately climbing a hill in his craving to get a glimpse of the sea from somewhere or other. The contiguity of salt water proved to be such a necessity of his existence that he preferred Budmouth as a place of residence, notwithstanding the society of his daughter in the other town. Thither he went and settled in lodgings in a green-shuttered cottage which had a bow window jutting out sufficiently to afford glimpses of a vertical strip of blue sea to anyone opening the sash, and leaning forward far enough to look through a narrow lane of tall intervening houses. Elizabeth Jane was standing in the middle of her upstairs parlour, critically surveying some rearrangement of articles with her head to one side, when the housemaid came in with the announcement, "Oh, please, ma'am, we know now how that bird-cage came there." In exploring her new domain during the first week of residence, gazing with critical satisfaction on this cheerful room and that, penetrating cautiously into dark cellars, sallying forth with gingerly tread to the garden, now leaf-strewn by autumn winds, and thus, like a wise field-marshal estimating the capabilities of the site whereon she was about to open her housekeeping campaign, Mrs. Donald Farfrae had discovered in a screened corner a new bird-cage shrouded in newspaper, and at the bottom of the cage a little ball of feathers, the dead body of a goldfinch. Nobody could tell her how the bird and cage had come there, though that the poor little songster had been starved to death was evident. The sadness of the incident had made an impression on her. She had not been able to forget it for days, despite Farfrae's tender banter, and now, when the matter had been nearly forgotten, it was again revived. "Oh, please, ma'am, we know how the bird-cage came there. That farmer's man who called on the evening of the wedding, he was seen with it in his hand as he came up the street, and 'tis thoughted that he put it down while he came in with his message, and then went away forgetting where he had left it." This was enough to set Elizabeth thinking, and in thinking she seized hold of the idea, at one feminine bound, that the caged bird had been brought by Henchard for her as a wedding gift and token of repentance. He had not expressed to her any regrets or excuses for what he had done in the past, but it was a part of his nature to extenuate nothing and live on as one of his own worst accusers. She went out, looked at the cage, buried the starved little singer, and from that hour her heart softened towards the self-alienated man. When her husband came in she told him her solution of the bird-cage mystery, and begged Donald to help her in finding out, as soon as possible, whither Henchard had banished himself, that she might make her peace with him, try to do something to render his life less that of an outcast and more tolerable to him. Although Farfrae had never so passionately liked Henchard as Henchard had liked him, he had, on the other hand, never so passionately hated in the same direction as his former friend had done, and he was therefore not the least indisposed to assist Elizabeth Jane in her laudable plan. But it was by no means easy to set about discovering Henchard. He had apparently sunk into the earth on leaving Mr. and Mrs. Farfrae's door. Elizabeth Jane remembered what he had once attempted, and trembled. But though she did not know it, Henchard had become a changed man since then, as far, that is, as change of emotional basis can justify such a radical phrase, and she needed not to fear. In a few days Farfrae's inquiries elicited that Henchard had been seen by one who knew him walking steadily along the Melchester highway eastward at 12 o'clock at night, in other words, retracing his steps on the road by which he had come. This was enough, and the next morning Farfrae might have been discovered driving his gig out of Casterbridge in that direction, Elizabeth Jane sitting beside him, wrapped in a thick flat fur, the Victorine of the period, her complexion somewhat richer than formerly, and an incipient matronly dignity which the serene Minerva eyes of one whose gestures beamed with mind made becoming, settling on her face. Having herself arrived at a promising haven from at least the grosser troubles of her life, her object was to place Henchard in some similar quietude before he should sink into that lower stage of existence which was only too possible to him now. After driving along the highway for a few miles they made further inquiries, and learnt of a road-mender who had been working thereabouts for weeks that he had observed such a man at the time mentioned. He had left the Melchester coach road at Weatherbury by a forking highway which skirted the north of Egdon Heath. Into this road they directed the horse's head, and soon were bowling across that ancient country whose surface never had been stirred to a finger's depth save by the scratchings of rabbits, since brushed by the feet of the earliest tribes. The tumuli these had left behind, done and shagged with heather, jutted roundly into the sky from the uplands, as though they were the full breasts of Diana Multimammia supinely extended there. They searched Egdon, but found no Henchard. Farfrae drove onward, and by the afternoon reached the neighbourhood of some extension of the heath to the north of Anglebury, a prominent feature of which, in the form of a blasted clump of firs on a summit of a hill, they soon passed under. That the road they were following had, up to this point, been Henchard's track on foot, they were pretty certain, but the ramifications which now began to reveal themselves in the route made further progress in the right direction a matter of pure guesswork, and Donald strongly advised his wife to give up the search in person, and trust to other means for obtaining news of her stepfather. They were now a score of miles at least from home, but by resting the horse for a couple of hours at a village they had just traversed, it would be possible to get back to Casterbridge that same day, while to go much further afield would reduce them to the necessity of camping out for the night. "And that will make a hole in a sovereign," said Farfrae. She pondered the position and agreed with him. He accordingly drew rein, but before reversing their direction paused a moment and looked vaguely round upon the wide country which the elevated position disclosed. While they looked, a solitary human form came from under the clump of trees and crossed ahead of them. The person was some labourer. His gait was shambling, his regard fixed in front of him as absolutely as if he wore blinkers, and in his hand he carried a few sticks. Having crossed the road he descended into a ravine, where a cottage revealed itself, which he entered. "If it were not so far away from Casterbridge, I should say that must be poor Whittle. 'Tis just like him," observed Elizabeth Jane. "And it may be Whittle, for he's never been to the yard these 3 weeks, going away without saying any word at all, and I owing him for 2 days' work without knowing who to pay it to." The possibility led them to alight, and at least make an inquiry at the cottage. Farfrae hitched the reins to the gate-post, and they approached what was of humble dwellings surely the humblest. The walls, built of kneaded clay, originally faced with a trowel, had been worn by years of rain washings to a lumpy crumbling surface, channelled and sunken from its plane, its grey rents held together here and there by a leafy strap of ivy which could scarcely find substance enough for the purpose. The rafters were sunken, and the thatch of the roof in ragged holes. Leaves from the fence had been blown into the corners of the doorway, and lay there undisturbed. The door was ajar. Farfrae knocked, and he who stood before them was Whittle, as they had conjectured. His face showed marks of deep sadness, his eyes lighting on them with an unfocused gaze, and he still held in his hand the few sticks he had been out to gather. As soon as he recognized them he started. "What, Abel Whittle, is it that ye are here?" said Farfrae. Yes, sir. You see, he was kind like to mother when she were here below, though 'a was rough to me." "Who are you talking of?" "Oh, sir, Mr. Henchit. Didn't ye know it? He's just gone, about half an hour ago by the sun, for I've got no watch to my name." "Not dead?" faltered Elizabeth Jane. "Yes, ma'am, he's gone. He was kind like to mother when she were here below, sending her the best ship coal and hardly any ashes from it at all, and taties and such like that were very needful to her. I seed en go down street on the night of your worshipful's wedding to the lady at your side, and I thought he looked low and faltering, and I followed en over Grey's Bridge, and he turned and seed me and said, 'You go back.' But I followed, and he turned again and said, 'Do you hear, sir? Go back.' But I zeed that he was low, and I followed on still. Then 'a said, 'Whittle, what do ye follow me for, when I've told ye to go back all these times?' And I said, 'Because, sir, I see things be bad with thee, and ye were kind like to mother if ye were rough to me, and I would fain be kind like to you.' Then he walked on, and I followed, and he never complained at me no more. We walked on like that all night, and in the blue of the morning, when 'twas hardly day, I looked ahead of me, and I zeed that he wambled, and could hardly drag along. By the time we had got past here, but I had seen that this house was empty as I went by, and I got him to come back, and I took down the boards from the windows and helped him inside. 'What, Whittle,' he said, 'and can ye really be such a poor fond fool as to care for such a wretch as I?' Then I went on further, and some neighbourly woodman lent me a bed and a chair and a few other traps, and we brought him here, and made him as comfortable as we could. But he didn't gain strength, for you see, ma'am, he couldn't eat, no appetite at all, and he got weaker, and to-day he died. One of the neighbours have gone to get a man to measure him." "Dear me, is that so?" said Farfrae. As for Elizabeth, she said nothing. "Upon the head of his bed he pinned a piece of paper with some writing upon it," continued Abel Whittle. "But not being a man o' letters I can't read writing, so I don't know what it is. I can get it and show ye." They stood in silence while he ran into the cottage, returning in a moment with a crumpled scrap of paper. On it there was pencilled as follows: "Michael Henchard's will. That Elizabeth Jane Farfrae be not told of my death, or made to grieve on account of me, and that I be not buried in consecrated ground, and that no sexton be asked to toll the bell, and that nobody is wished to see my dead body, and that no mourners walk behind me at my funeral, and that no flowers be planted on my grave, and that no man remember me. To this I put my name, Michael Henchard." "What are we to do?" said Donald, when he had handed the paper to her. She could not answer distinctly. "Oh, Donald," she cried at last through her tears, "what bitterness lies there! Oh, I would not have minded so much if it had not been for my unkindness at that last parting. But there's no altering. So it must be." What Henchard had written in the anguish of his dying was respected as far as practicable by Elizabeth Jane, though less from a sense of the sacredness of last words as such than from her independent knowledge that the man who wrote them meant what he said. She knew the directions to be a piece of the same stuff that his whole life was made of, and hence were not to be tampered with to give herself a mournful pleasure, or her husband credit for large-heartedness. All was over at last, even her regrets for having misunderstood him on his last visit, for not having searched him out sooner, though these were deep and sharp for a good while. From this time forward Elizabeth Jane found herself in a latitude of calm weather, kindly and grateful in itself, and doubly so after the Capharnaum in which some of her preceding years had been spent. As the lively and sparkling emotions of her early married life cohered into an equable serenity, the finer movements of her nature found scope in discovering to the narrow-lived ones around her the secret, as she had once learnt it, of making limited opportunities endurable, which she deemed to consist in the cunning enlargement, by a species of microscopic treatment, of those minute forms of satisfaction that offer themselves to everybody, not in positive pain, which, thus handled, have much of the same inspiring effect upon life as wider interests cursorily embraced. Her teaching had a reflex action upon herself, insomuch that she thought she could perceive no great personal difference between being respected in the nether parts of Casterbridge and glorified at the uppermost end of the social world. Her position was indeed to a marked degree one that, in the common phrase, afforded much to be thankful for. That she was not demonstratively thankful was no fault of hers. Her experience had been of a kind to teach her, rightly or wrongly, that the doubtful honour of a brief transmit through a sorry world hardly called for effusiveness, even when the path was suddenly irradiated at some half-way point by daybeams rich as hers. But her strong sense that neither she nor any human being deserved less than was given did not blind her to the fact that there were others receiving less who had deserved much more. And in being forced to class herself among the fortunate, she did not cease to wonder at the persistence of the unforeseen, when the one to whom such unbroken tranquillity had been accorded in the adult stage was she whose youth had seemed to teach that happiness was but the occasional episode in a general drama of pain. End of Chapter 45. End of The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Read by Debra Lynn.